Hey guys, welcome back to The Last Climb. In today's story, this young couple decided a slow-moving rope line was the only thing standing between them and the summit they had spent years saving for.
Their rush would leave both of them trapped in a storm, with the cold slowly taking away what little strength they had left. It was late May, 2019. High above Camp 4 on Everest, the route narrowed into one fixed line over rock and old ice. Wind dragged snow across the ridge, and the slope dropped away hard on one side. Up here, above roughly 26,000 feet, climbers call it the death zone. The air holds only about a third of the oxygen available at sea level, and every extra minute on the mountain takes something out of you. Jeff Farrow was 26 years old and worked as a commercial painter outside Denver, Colorado. Danielle Holcomb was 24 and worked as a bar manager. They had been together 3 years, building their relationship around weekend trips into the mountains, day hikes turning into overnight climbs, and overnight climbs turning into short, technical routes on peaks most people had never heard of. Everest was the trip they had been saving toward for 2 years straight. The kind of climb that eats a person's vacation days and their bank account in one shot.
They had done what a lot of ambitious couples do. They found something they both loved, got better at it together, and kept raising the bar.
First, let me explain a little about how a climb like this actually works, because it matters for everything that comes later. Guided Everest expeditions do not just walk up the mountain once. Climbers spend weeks moving up and down between camps before the actual summit attempt, sleeping a little higher each rotation, letting their bodies adjust before dropping back down to recover. It is slow on purpose. The body needs that time to build up red blood cells and get used to functioning with less oxygen. Skip that process, and a climber can look completely fine 1 hour and become confused, uncoordinated, and a danger to themselves the next. Above the death zone, almost everyone climbs with bottled oxygen, carried in pressurized bottles and fed through a mask by a small regulator that controls how much flows out each minute. Climbers switch to a fresh bottle at set points along the route, since a single tank does not last the whole push to the summit and back. Run the flow rate too high, and you burn through a bottle faster than planned. Run it too low to stretch the supply, and the body starts losing the fight against the altitude that much sooner. Every climber on that mountain is doing that math constantly, whether they want to or not. That is why guided expeditions set a hard turnaround time before every summit push, a specific hour agreed on in advance, by which every climber has to start heading back down no matter how close they are to the top. It sounds simple, standing at base camp reading it off a briefing sheet. It is a completely different thing to actually turn around 40 minutes from the summit of the tallest mountain on Earth.
I've talked about this before with big mountains. Getting to the top is the part everybody pictures, but you still have to turn around and walk all the way down when you are colder, more tired, and carrying less oxygen than before.
Jeff and Danielle joined a guided group of 8 paying clients that season, along with a lead guide and several Sherpa climbers who handled camp support, oxygen supplies, loads, and much of the technical support higher on the mountain. Neither Jeff nor Danielle had climbed Everest before, but both had been above 20,000 feet on guided climbs of Aconcagua, Lobuche East, and Island Peak. Their training also included Colorado 14ers, an ice climbing course, and stair workouts with weighted packs. Still, Everest does not care how hard someone trained at home. Above the death zone, patience and judgment matter as much as fitness. During the early rotations up the mountain before the actual summit push, one of the other clients started noticing something about Jeff in particular. This client, a man in his 50s, on his second Everest attempt, spent enough time near Jeff and Danielle over those weeks, sharing meals, sharing tents at the lower camps, that he ended up seeing more of them than most of the group did. He later said Jeff pushed back more than once against how slowly the acclimatization schedule moved, arguing at one of the camps that they were being too cautious and were going to burn through their summit window sitting around waiting. He was not shy about saying it either. That same client remembered Jeff telling one of the guides, loud enough for several people nearby to hear, that the pace they were keeping was going to cost them the whole climb. I get the frustration behind that, at least a little. You save for 2 years, you take time off work you cannot really afford to take off, and then you spend most of your trip walking slowly up and down the same stretch of mountain, over and over, while your actual shot at the summit sits somewhere out ahead of you on a calendar nobody controls. Still, frustration does not make the schedule optional. On a mountain like Everest, The slow parts are often the parts keeping people alive.
That is a tough thing for some people to accept. You spend years learning to push harder. When a climb gets difficult, then Everest turns around and tells you to slow down or go home.
A few days after that first exchange, during a rotation up toward Camp 3, Danielle was seen moving past two slower climbers on a section of trail that was not even particularly narrow, cutting around them on the outside edge rather than waiting for a wider spot to pass. Neither of those climbers fell or came close to falling. One of them later described it as more aggressive than it needed to be, since Danielle could have waited for a wider spot just ahead. By the time the group made it to Camp 4, the forecast had narrowed to a short window, with winds expected to ease overnight before building again late the next morning. Multiple expeditions were targeting the same nights, which is common enough on Everest during a good window, but it also means one very specific problem: traffic. People hear traffic and picture a slow drive or a packed airport. Up there, traffic means climbers standing in the cold, clipped to the same rope, burning through oxygen while the mountain keeps taking heat out of them. Camp 4 sits on the South Col, a flat, wind-scoured shelf of rock wedged between two ridgelines, more of a staging ground than a real campsite. Old equipment and torn scraps of tent fabric from past seasons are half buried in the rock and ice around the newer tents, a permanent kind of clutter that nobody bothers hauling out at that altitude. The wind up there rarely stops completely, and even standing still inside camp, most climbers keep every layer zipped up.
I do not think Camp 4 is the kind of place anyone ever gets comfortable in. You are already high enough that sleep barely counts as rest, and every person in those tents knows the hard part is still waiting above them.
The lead guide gathered the group before they left Camp 4 that night and went over the plan one more time. Bottled oxygen usage, expected pace, and the turnaround time, 11 in the morning, no exceptions, no matter how close anyone was to the summit at that point. The lead guide would move ahead with the faster clients, while a senior Sherpa was assigned to stay near the middle and back of the group. Traffic later split that plan apart. That same client later confirmed that detail specifically, since it came up again afterward in conversations nobody wanted to be having. They left Camp 4 a little after 9 at night. Above them, a thin line of headlamps stretched up the ridge as far as anyone could see. Dozens of climbers from several different expeditions all moving on the same fixed ropes toward the same summit on the same night. The temperature had dropped well below zero, cold enough that any exposed skin started to sting within minutes. The wind was manageable that early, just enough to make the headlamp beams flicker slightly whenever a gust came through. For the first few hours, the pace was steady, just slower than the group had planned. Other teams were moving carefully through icy sections, and a Sherpa crew had stopped traffic briefly to reset part of a fixed rope. By the time Jeff and Danielle reached the upper ridge, the group was already close to an hour behind the schedule set at Camp 4. At that point, nobody in the group seemed overly concerned about the lost time. On a summit push, people can lose time early and still hope the line opens up later. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it just keeps getting worse. Jeff and Danielle moved somewhere in the middle of their group, clipped into the fixed line, one behind the other, oxygen masks on, the rhythm of the climb settling into something almost mechanical. Step, breathe, step, breathe. At that altitude, in the dark, with a headlamp showing you maybe 10 feet of trail at a time, that rhythm is really all there is. That same client from their group was climbing close enough behind them that night to see most of what happened over the next hour. The rest of the group was farther ahead, out of sight around a bend in the ridge, and would only hear about it once everyone regrouped at the next rest point. The trouble started a few hours later on the triangular face below the balcony, at roughly 27,000 feet, where the route narrows between exposed rock and a steep open slope. This is one of the spots on Everest where bottlenecks happen almost every season, because only one climber can move through it at a time, clipped into the same length of rope. That night, with multiple expeditions converging on the same stretch, and the whole group already running behind, the line backed up badly.
This is where the whole summit push stops feeling like a climb and starts feeling like a waiting game nobody can really win. You are too high to stand around for long, but there is nowhere else to go and no way to pass safely until the people ahead of you move.
The lead guide for Jeff and Danielle's group was already ahead of them, beyond the bottleneck, where he had stopped with part of the group during a slowdown higher on the route. He was not in position to see any of what happened at the bottleneck himself. Everything he knew about it that night came to him secondhand, over the radio, a few minutes after the fact. Climbers ahead of Jeff and Danielle came to a stop, one after another, clipped in and simply standing there in the cold and the dark, waiting for whatever was holding up the line somewhere above them. A few minutes of that is normal on a summit night. This stretched past 20 minutes, then closer to 30. Dozens of climbers standing nearly motionless on a rope line high in the death zone, each of them burning oxygen they had budgeted for actual movement. On top of the hour, they were already down. If you have never been at that altitude, it is hard to explain what standing still that long actually costs a person. You are not resting. Your body is still working just as hard to keep you alive, still burning through the same limited oxygen supply, except now none of that effort is getting you any closer to the top or back down to safety. Every minute stopped is a minute you cannot get back later, and everyone on that line knew the math, even if nobody was doing it out loud. Jeff kept checking his watch through the wait, according to that same client, still close enough behind him in the group to notice. As the minutes ticked past the half-hour mark with barely any movement in the line, he unclipped from his position on the rope. Unclipping from the fixed line, even for a few feet, is one of the things climbers are trained not to do up there. In that section, the fixed line was the one reliable point of protection if a climber lost their footing on the slope. Jeff moved along the outside edge of the trail instead, using the rope with one hand for balance rather than staying clipped into it. Danielle followed a few feet behind him, doing the same thing.
It is one thing for a person to make a bad call in a moment like that. Watching the other person follow right behind makes the whole thing harder to understand.
Ahead of them on the line, clipped in and waiting their turn like everyone else, were two other climbers on a different expedition. Gavin Stewart was 53, an experienced high-altitude climber attempting his first 8,000-meter peak. His climbing partner, Sonia Gardner, was 44. They had trained together for more than a year before committing to the trip. They were clipped into the fixed rope, waiting because the entire route had stopped. As Jeff came up alongside Gavin in the narrow section, he pushed past him on the outside edge of the trail, close enough that his shoulder caught Gavin across the chest. Gavin's boots slid out from under him on the packed snow, and his weight dropped hard onto the line, still clipped to his harness. The line caught his weight before he slid any farther down the slope, though the sudden jolt left his arm twisted at an awkward angle where he had instinctively grabbed for the rope with both hands as he fell. He hung there, unable to pull himself back up on his own, until a Sherpa guide working his way down the line from farther up reached him and helped haul him back onto the trail. Sonia stood directly behind Gavin in the line. When Jeff pushed past him, Danielle came up beside Sonia on the same narrow stretch and clipped her pack while trying to get around. The impact spun Sonia off the packed trail and onto the icy slope below the rope. Her crampon caught as she went down, but she still slid several feet before a climber lower on the line grabbed her harness and held her in place until the same guide who had helped Gavin could work his way toward her and bring her back toward the fixed rope. Neither Gavin nor Sonia went over the edge that night. Both were shaken. Both were hurt. Gavin with an arm and shoulder injury that would need real treatment once he got off the mountain. Sonia with cuts and heavy bruising along one side from the slide. But both of them were alive, clipped back onto solid ground within a couple of minutes of going down.
I think luck did a lot of work for them there. Later that same day, Jeff and Danielle would need that kind of luck themselves.
Gavin stayed clipped into the line while the guide checked his shoulder as best he could in the dark. Sonia held the rope with both hands and kept her eyes down on the snow beneath her boots until the group was ready to move again. The client from Jeff and Danielle's own group saw the push happen from a short distance back in the line, close enough to make out what happened, but too far back to reach either fallen climber himself. He had a helmet camera running, the kind a lot of climbers use to document their summit attempts, and it caught Jeff pushing past Gavin, along with several seconds of Sonia's slide down the slope afterward. The Sherpa guide who reached Gavin only arrived from above a moment after the fall itself, so his account started partway through. Gavin already hanging off the rope, Sonia already down on the slope below. Between the two of them, though, the sequence matched up almost exactly, down to the order everything happened in. Jeff and Danielle did not stop to check on either of them. They kept moving past the narrow section, back onto the wider part of the trail above it, continuing up toward the summit while Gavin was still being helped back onto solid footing behind them. Word of what happened reached the lead guide by radio within a few minutes, relayed by the Sherpa who had helped Gavin and Sonia. Static and wind broke up the first report, but the guide understood enough to order Jeff and Danielle to stop at the next safe flat section and wait for the senior Sherpa coming up behind them. The radio log recorded several seconds of silence before Jeff answered that they would deal with it after the summit, not before. The guide repeated that their summit attempt was over and told them again to stop. But Jeff and Danielle had already moved above the triangular face toward the balcony, where trying to intercept them would have blocked the line and put more climbers at risk. The senior Sherpa was delayed below them by traffic, and Jeff and Danielle never waited long enough to be reached. That decision cost them time. By the final stretch below the summit, they were behind their group and moving without support nearby. Behind them, once Gavin was steady enough to move again, his own group made the call to keep descending rather than push on. Gavin's shoulder was not going to hold up to another several hours of climbing, and Sonia, still shaking from the fall, did not argue the decision. Their summit attempt ended right there on the rope, hours before sunrise, the two of them working their way back down toward Camp 4 with help from their guide, while the rest of the mountain kept climbing above them.
That was the practical choice, even if it was not the choice either of them had trained for. On Everest, a summit attempt can end in the middle of a rope line with no dramatic announcement and no real time to argue about it.
Jeff and Danielle reached the summit sometime after 10:30 that morning. Based on the timestamps later pulled from Jeff's camera, there is not much room to stand at the top of Everest, just a small, sloped patch of snow and rock with prayer flags snapping hard in the wind, and a short line of other climbers waiting their own turn for a photo before starting back down. Most climbers do not linger there long, even under good conditions, and Jeff and Danielle's photos, timestamped only a few minutes apart, suggest they did not either. There was little to see beyond a wall of thin cloud already building in the distance, and less time than usual to look at it. Whatever this moment was supposed to feel like after 2 years of saving and training, the clock was already working against them by the time they reached it. The weather held through most of that morning, but the forecast had warned that the calmer window might begin closing by late morning. Not long after Jeff and Danielle started down, climbers higher on the mountain began reporting stronger gusts along the ridge and cloud building across the route. The change came in stages, not all at once. Wind picked up first, driving loose snow across the fixed line. Then the cloud thickened and flattened everything into the same white and gray. Within maybe 40 minutes, visibility had dropped hard, blowing snow filling the air thick enough that climbers on the same rope line could barely make out the person a few feet ahead of them. The gust became strong enough that shouting was useless more than a few feet away, with spindrift hissing low across the ridge. The weather did not need to turn into some huge dramatic blizzard to change the whole route. A little more wind, less visibility, and slower movement were enough to make every decision feel heavier. A climber descending behind Jeff and Danielle that morning, part of a separate guided group using the same fixed line, later gave the clearest account of what happened next. He had passed them near the summit not long before, noting they arrived later than most others still up there, though he had no way of knowing exactly how much oxygen either of them had left in their tanks at that point. He was running low on his own oxygen too, watching his gauge as carefully as he was watching the rope in front of him, which is part of why he could not do much more than notice them from a distance. He said he lost sight of them for long stretches as the storm worsened, the wind driving snow sideways across the route hard enough to cut visibility down to almost nothing at times. When the wind let up for a few seconds here and there, he caught brief glimpses of two figures still moving along the rope ahead of him, but slower each time he saw them. At that altitude, exhaustion does not look like exhaustion the way it might lower down. It looks like someone stopping to rest and taking longer each time to get moving again. It looks like fumbling with a simple clip that should take 2 seconds and instead takes 20, fingers gone stiff and clumsy inside layers of gloves that cannot keep up with cold like that. Ice builds up fast along a mask or a pair of goggles at that altitude too, crusting over eyelashes and eyebrows, narrowing what little a person can already see through blowing snow. The bottleneck, the radio delay, and the late summit had added hours onto the timeline their oxygen plan was built around, and by that point in the descent, both were almost certainly working with far less oxygen than the trip down was supposed to require. The same descending climber said he saw Danielle sit down beside the rope at one point, not far below where the trail widened slightly. He said Jeff crouched next to her, apparently trying to get her moving again, though the wind and blowing snow made it hard to see exactly what was happening between them for more than a few seconds at a time. He continued down the rope line. At that altitude, with his own oxygen running low and the storm closing in, stopping beside them could have left 3 climbers stranded instead of 2. There was no flat, sheltered place to wait with them, no spare oxygen he could safely hand over, and no way to get either of them moving without putting himself off balance on the fixed line. Once he reached a lower section where his radio could connect, he reported their last known position and condition to his guide. From there, it took hours to organize a response. Radio reports were fragmented, the storm limited visibility, and guides had to find Sherpas with enough oxygen to turn back upward. A small team from 2 expeditions finally headed toward the last known position, following the fixed ropes because searching the open slope in those conditions was too dangerous.
Even the people coming to help had to treat the mountain like it could take them next. That is what makes a rescue that high up so brutal. The team had to move carefully, while every minute mattered.
They worked from the last known trail point and followed the fixed line upward through the storm, checking every bend and wider patch of snow where a climber might have stopped. They found Jeff first, not far from where the descending climber had last seen them, still clipped to the rope. Frost had already built up along his jacket, hood, and mask by the time they reached him, and he did not respond when they tried to rouse him. A short distance farther up the route, they found Danielle, also clipped in and unresponsive, her gear in the same frosted-over condition as his. Neither showed any sign of having fallen. Both were exactly where they had apparently stopped moving, sitting or slumped against the rope, as if the mountain had simply stopped giving either of them anything more to work with. Given the extreme altitude and the real danger involved in any recovery effort that high on Everest, the decision was made to leave both bodies where they were found, which is standard practice for that section of the mountain where the risk of moving a body through that terrain in bad weather often outweighs whatever is gained by bringing them down right away. The official finding attributed both deaths to exposure and hypothermia at extreme altitude, worsened by exhaustion and depleted oxygen after a delayed summit attempt. The bottleneck, the refusal to rejoin support, the late descent, and worsening weather were all listed as contributing factors. Investigators pieced the timeline together using radio logs from that night, accounts from other climbers who had been on the route, the helmet camera footage from the bottleneck incident, and the timestamps recovered from Jeff's own camera at the summit. The records placed them late to the summit and descending alone as the weather closed in. There was no evidence that either had fallen from the route, been struck by another climber, or suffered a new equipment failure during the descent. The rest of their group summited within the planned turnaround window and made it back to Camp 4 safely that same day. Most of them learned what had happened after they were back at Camp 4, when it became clear Jeff and Danielle had not returned with the group. Gavin Stewart made it off the mountain that same day, his arm wrapped and supported, in serious pain, but stable. Sonia Gardner came down with him, covered in bruises and cuts along one side of her body, shaken badly by the fall, but otherwise all right. Both were able to leave base camp under their own power within a few days once they had recovered enough to travel. Jeff Farrow and Danielle Holcomb never made it back down.
Maybe that is the part Everest forces people to learn. You can get ahead of someone on the rope, but you never get ahead of the mountain.